Welcome back to another episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Ann-Margaret, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brent Doty. On this episode, we are welcoming Executive Director for External and Regulatory Affairs, Marc Friberg. Marc oversees one of the agency's first departments, Regulatory Affairs, which administers several regulatory programs related to groundwater protection and production. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
In his debut feature, Marc is going to walk us through a snapshot of how the EAA began as a regulatory agency, our programs related to groundwater production and protection, and how we work with other entities and organizations to ensure the quality and quantity of water in the Edwards Aquifer for more than 2.5 million South Central Texans. So Marc, can you paint a picture for our listeners of how the EAA was established and what factors created the need for improved regulation of the Edwards Aquifer?
Sure. The Edwards was created officially in 1993. It didn't go into operations until 1996 for various reasons that had to do with the establishment of our enabling legislation. But essentially, the Edwards was a long time coming. There was a lot of interest in how the use of the Edwards was regulated over time. And essentially what happened was because of ongoing drought and the massive growth that was taking place in the area and that continues today, that created the need for a federal lawsuit in some people's mind to require the protection of the endangered species that lived in Comal and San Marcos Springs. And based on that lawsuit, there was the threat of federal intervention to regulate and manage the aquifer. So Texas, basically, the state led an effort to avoid that federal intervention, and the legislature created and passed the Edwards Aquifer Authority Act, which created the Edwards Aquifer Authority as an entity and gave it its regulatory powers.
So back then, kind of like today, there was a lot of pressure to drill more wells and have a lot more development, and that was leading to some concern over spring flow, right?
Right, and you know, the more the Edwards is pumped, the less spring flow takes place, or if there's severe drought, it impacts the spring flow as well. So there was a concern that this region would continue to grow and that there would be more withdrawals from the aquifer, and that could lead to the springs drying up, which has happened before, and there was a concern that could become a permanent situation. So because Texas doesn't necessarily recognize the connection between groundwater and surface water as far as water law is concerned, the idea that the endangered species could provide that nexus to a regulatory management scheme was brought up, and that was the driving factor behind the lawsuits. And then the Edwards was established for all the reasons to manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer.
Now, one of the first missions of the EAA when it was established was to permit the water. I know you weren't here during that process, but that must have been a lengthy and difficult process to permit folks that have been using water for generations in the Edwards.
Well, right. I mean, the Edwards started operating in 96, like I said before, but the final order issuing permits really didn't happen until 2008. It was a long process. It was a lot of fact finding, a lot of arguments, a lot of opportunities for what we call a contested case hearing over the water rights. And our system is set up in a way where your water rights were issued on a historical use basis, and that's fairly unique to the Edwards in the state as far as groundwater management is concerned. So essentially what you had to do was come in and prove that you used a certain amount of groundwater during a specific time period that was established by the legislature with the intent that you were going to protect those that had relied on the aquifer, that they were going to have an opportunity to continue to rely on the aquifer and its use. And as you proved up your use, you eventually got to a scenario where you got a permit for that use.
And were those typically like people all across our jurisdiction, or did those happen to be like irrigators and farmers out west, or was it just a variety of different people?
It's everybody. It's an industrial user, it's a municipal user, it's an agricultural user. Those types of use were recognized, and you had to show your historical use. You did it in different ways because of the type of use you had, but you still showed your historic use, and hopefully that led to a permit that was close to that use in some sense. There had to be adjustments because the idea that we needed to protect spring flow at a certain level meant that the Edwards had to cap the amount of permits that it issued at a certain volume. Mm-hmm. And that's another unique aspect to the management of the Edwards is the scheme that was set up, the permitting scheme that was set up in our legislation required the Edwards to eventually say no, mm-hmm. that you couldn't get any more water. Today, we cannot issue a new permit. There's essentially a cap and trade system that's been set up by our legislation whereby we issued all the permits that we could to hopefully honor the historic use that had taken place, but also honor the cap on withdrawals. And that cap changed a little over time.
Right.
For various reasons. Right now, the cap is at 572,000 acre feet per year of withdrawals. We've permitted that amount. There's not really a scenario where that amount's going to be adjusted again.
So just to put it into perspective, what is 1 acre foot equivalent to, Brent?
1 acre foot, if you imagine a football field with 1 foot of water on it, that's about an acre foot.
And so that times, 572,000 is what our cap is, right?
That's the amount that's permitted to be withdrawn on an annual basis. As an aside, we've never actually pumped that much water.
Oh, okay.
But that's how much is permitted to be withdrawn on an annual basis.
And that sounds like a lot of water, but mm-hmm. when you break it up over thousands of permittees, it becomes a very small pie mm-hmm. that you have to split up.
So going back to kind of the creation of the EAA and what we were founded on, what were some of the first regulatory programs of the agency, and how have they evolved? How have the programs grown or adapted over the years?
Well, first and foremost was the permitting mm-hmm. system that was put into place. Those permits were developed and issued, and from a regulatory standpoint, we have to ensure that users are abiding by those permits. Mm-hmm. So along with the permitting requirements came a metering requirement. Every well that's permitted has to be metered. An exempt well is different. That's a domestic or livestock use well. That's not included in that 572,000 cap. You don't get a permit for that. It's an exempt use. But if you have a permit, you're required to meter your use and report that use on a yearly basis so that the Edwards can confirm that everyone is abiding by their permits. So that would be the first true regulatory program that was put into place mm-hmm. by the Edwards. You follow up with that on ways to enhance the way the aquifer is managed. There's a conservation program that's laid on top of the permitting process. We have what we call critical period management plan, mm-hmm. and essentially based on environmental factors, the Edwards has the ability to curtail the use of those permits. We can pull down the amount that you're permitted based on stages of drought. And that's a part of the permitting process. That's part of our legislation. And if you look at a permit that's filed, all our permits are filed in the county deed records. They're real property. But if you look, there is an ongoing jurisdictional issue for the Edwards in that we can curtail your use based on drought. And that's what you see when you see stage 1 drought, stage 2 drought, stage 3 drought, as it pertains to the Edwards. And that's an important point because that's different than what you'll see from a municipality. When they go into stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 drought, they're talking about your individual use at your house. And when we talk about a municipal use, that's watering your lawn. You get your water days. Mm-hmm. That's not what the Edwards does. The Edwards will reduce your permit by a certain percentage based on where we are in those environmental factors. If we're in stage 1, stage 2, it's a different reduction in percentage, but that's on a yearly basis. Mm-hmm. So if I have a 100 acre foot permit, and we're in stage 1 for the entire year, my permit would be reduced by the Edwards by 20%. I need to find out as a user how I can meet my needs with that reduction. And that's why cities implement lawn watering days and different types of conservation restrictions. But those are separate and apart from what the Edwards does. All the Edwards says is, this is how much water you can use this year. And the user develops their own programs and policies to ensure that they can meet that reduction.
For example, like SAWS and NBU, like there are the municipalities that manage the water in those areas, right?
Correct. We don't tell them they have to put in lawn watering days.
Yes.
But they do that in a way to manage their use so that they can ensure that they meet their permit reductions.
And we've talked about this on the podcast before, but these reductions are based on water levels in our monitoring wells, J17 and J27 in Uvalde, and at our springs at San Marcos and New Braunfels. So when those levels in either the springs or the wells drop below a certain height, that's when we start triggering this drought response. And the point of it is to slow down that decline in the aquifer. If we didn't have this, the aquifer would drop more rapidly during drought and potentially even dry up at the springs in exceptional drought.
Mm-hmm. Are those the main ones, the permitting and then the CPM?
I think that was the initial establishment of a regulatory program.
Uh-huh.
On top of those, we have some water quality regulatory powers, and those are used to help protect, the quality of the water. As we're moving forward as a regulatory entity, we have to look at the Edwards as both protecting its quantity and protecting its quality. So the Edwards has water quality regulations, mostly having to do with activities on our recharge zone, the sensitive part of the aquifer. And while it's not a land use type of regulatory program, it does protect activities that take place on those, protects against any negative impacts from activities that take place on the recharge zone. And that has a lot to do with how you store regulated or hazardous materials. We have a tank program where we require certain types of containment, secondary, tertiary containment for hydrocarbon tanks and other regulated materials. We look at how facilities store smaller amounts of regulated materials, but they have a whole lot of those regulatory materials. So, massive warehouses of chemicals and things. We don't tell you whether you can or cannot have that type of business, but what we do tell you is if you're going to have that type of business, you need to abide by these certain standards.
I see, yes.
And we have regulatory language to that effect.
Well, that makes sense, Mark. And I think a lot of our listeners may realize that as they're driving through the recharge zone, gas stations are sort of few and far between. And I imagine this has a little bit to do with it.
It does. It's not the primary factor. We require, if you're going to have an underground storage tank for a gas station, like you said, that you have tertiary containment. We have a similar process where we have a cap and trade on tanks on the recharge zone, in that in 2002 there was it was established that you couldn't have another underground storage tank that goes onto the recharge zone. That's a little bit different today in that we will allow new tanks to come in so long as you've either removed an older tank or you could get what we call capacity from another owner of a tank or another gas station. If a gas station closes down, a new gas station could open up. It gets a little complicated for the regulated community in that's the Edwards rule. Now, there's different sets of rules in the city of San Antonio. They may not care whether you have capacity or you've closed down a gas station. They may prohibit it outright. There's different rules in New Braunfels. There's different rules by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. The driver of all environmental regulations in Texas is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. What the Edwards does is complement those programs and hopefully work together in a reasonable way. But then you also have to meet development codes for cities and meet those other types of regulations. So we're neither the lead nor the end-all be-all for those types of water quality regulations. We are a part of the whole process. So we encourage people to educate themselves on what we require and what others require. And hopefully those complement each other. Nobody wants to have dual regulations that accomplish the same thing.
So it's kind of like a collaborative approach between these agencies and these entities.
Yes, I would agree with that. And what we're trying to do is make it more of a collaborative approach as we move forward, because everybody has their job to do, and hopefully we can find ways to work together. And that includes the regulated community. And
ultimately, as these new facilities are approved, the new tanks are approved, they're more protective than whatever they're replacing generally.
Right.
What about the first responders program? Does that fit into the puzzle here somewhere?
Yes, that I guess is a regulatory program for us. I see it more as a resource. It's a tool that we provide. Years ago, there was a massive mulch fire in San Antonio. People referred to it as mulchy. And that fire had a lot of air quality issues and the potential for water quality issues. And it created quite a stir in the regulated community And essentially what happened after that, there was legislation passed that beefed up the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality's regulation of mulch sites. But there was also an insertion into our enabling legislation that essentially said the Edwards will create rules to address fires on the recharge zone. And it was fairly broad and fairly vague. And we went through a lot of trial and error to understand exactly what that meant for the Edwards and what was our role in that type of an activity from a regulatory standpoint. And where we are today, I think it's exciting. I think it's the right path for the Edwards, is that we created, and we got some help over the last 2 or 3 years from the city of San Antonio. There was a grant that we were able to partner with Texas A&M University to help facilitate the process. And what we've done is we've worked to create an educational program for firefighters and first responders on what does it mean when there's a event on the recharge zone. When would it be appropriate to let something burn and not put a lot of water on it, because you're washing potentially hazardous chemicals into the Edwards while you're trying to put out the fire. And so part of our process right now, and we're hoping to expand it, is that we've created a mapping, a GIS system, whereby if a first responder comes to a site, comes to an area where there's a fire going on or some other type of disaster that they've been called to address, we've at least provided them with the tools to understand what is what we call a sensitive feature on the recharge zone. What is something that's capable of taking on that water? What are some practices that you can use, some tools that you can use to help prevent fire water from running into the Edwards? Understanding that, human health and safety comes first.
Yes,
they're always going to do what they need to do to save a life. But if they have the opportunity to make an informed decision on how to address a fire, based on some of the information that we provided them, we would like to make sure that we've provided that to them. And hopefully this program can grow. Right now we've mapped the Bexar County recharge zone area. Staff did a lot of work to provide pretty sophisticated GIS mapping. It was coupled with a model that showed how water would flow on properties based on contours. So they know where the water would go, and they know where the sensitive features are. They know where stormwater structures are created that they could potentially use as holding structures. They could close them, and they could capture the firefighting water that could be removed later appropriately. And so we think we've taken a good step in the right direction. And that's not, like I said, it's not really a regulatory program, but it's based on a legal requirement for us to have a program from the state. And so I think you've talked about it before, regulation through service. That's kind of our mantra. This is a way for us to partner and try to find ways to protect the aquifer and have everyone involved.
Nice.
Yeah, we have talked about that concept with Roland before, general manager, and Earl Parker, one of your directors. But it's an interesting and unique concept that's not used in many other agencies. So I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit more. So, we've talked about permitting and some of the water quality initiatives. How does regulation through service remain effective at getting folks to do the right thing?
Well, we're working to make it effective. I mean, no regulatory program is perfect, and there's always going to be people who don't like the regulation. Sometimes it's difficult to implement a regulation. There's a lot of factors that have to be taken into consideration. What we're hoping to do is find a way to incentivize regulation, to have buy-in from the regulated community. But if you're going to use the resource, it's there to be used. That's why we have a cap. That's why we are established. It just needs to be used appropriately. So a lot of it has to do with education. A lot of it has to do with not trying to pick fights, but trying to find reasonable solutions where the aquifer can be protected and that a reasonable path forward for somebody that wants to use a natural resource can use it in a responsible way. Now, that doesn't mean that the Edwards is never going to have to say no again. I mean, just like when we started our permitting process, we had to say no. There's going to be times where the Edwards has to say no, and that's our job, and that's what we will do from a regulatory perspective. But ideally, we get to a point to where there's an understanding of when and why we would say no, and everybody works together to find paths forward were reasonable and that are protective.
Right. I think that's a big part of it is listening to the regulated community about steps that may not be reasonable. A good example is, the chemical storage, hazardous substance storage. A lot of folks were saying our rules, though protective, maybe were unreasonable for this, and this, and we listened to them, right?
That's right. We had certain secondary containment rules that were pretty onerous, and sometimes they made sense and sometimes they didn't. And so we worked hard. We did some public rulemakings. We took a lot of comment, and that really helped facilitate the process that we have now. That's our regulatory programs outside of the tank world that deal with these facilities that store a lot of it has to do with just understanding what you have, letting us know what you have. The containment itself is there to be protected if there's a catastrophic event, but it's not as, at one point in time, if you read our rules just purely black and white, depending on how big a facility you had, you may have had to have secondary containment for your whiteout. I think
really?
that doesn't make sense. And so we've gotten to a point to where we're more about registration and understanding the information that's about your facility, so that we can address issues that may come about, so that you're aware of what's going on. And a lot of that now feeds that first responder program. Yeah. That information that we require in your registration, in your good practices as far as storage and management is concerned, a lot of that feeds into the first responder program. So it really does become this multifaceted collaborative approach to, and I wouldn't even say regulation, to protecting the aquifer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it makes sense to me that, this is a unique agency, the first of its kind in Texas and really in the nation, and you're having to develop rules to protect the aquifer. Of course, those are going to have to change over time and adapt based on feedback from stakeholders and your own science.
Right. We never want to operate in a vacuum. We want to make sure that what we're doing is appropriate. At the end of the day, we have to manage, we have to enhance, we have to protect the Edwards. And that's what we're going to do. But we want to do it in the most efficient and pragmatic way possible.
Mm-hmm. That transparency and that two-way communication ultimately is what you said. It's for the greater good of the aquifer.
That's right. And it brings legitimacy to our programs, and it brings a buy-in, hopefully. Mm-hmm. The honesty and transparency hopefully brings a buy-in to everybody that's trying. Everybody wants the same thing. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants the aquifer to be a viable resource for the generations to come, and that's what everybody's goal is.
Absolutely. So, Marc, how do these rules and regulations set us up to pursue other groundwater protection and conservation measures?
So, because we have the permitting system that we have, and the way that it is set up and the way the aquifer is physically set up, in that you can transfer water throughout the region. And that's the beauty of our permitting system. You don't have to, if you buy somebody's water right, or you lease somebody's water right, you don't have to put in infrastructure like you would in other parts of the state, where you're putting in a pipeline to pump water from their property to wherever you need to use it. Because of the karst nature of the aquifer, and I'm sure y'all have discussed this in other podcasts, that paper transfer of water means you can lease or buy someone's water from that's associated with their property or their place of use, so the facility that the industrial user has, or the well site that the municipal user has, and transfer that permit to your well site. And so you don't need above the ground infrastructure. The aquifer establishes its own infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, and because of the cap that we have on the permitted or allowed withdrawals, it gives us a lot of flexibility and the ability to be creative in how we handle conservation. And a lot of that shows up in our habitat conservation plan that was approved by the feds, in some programs that we call, one of them is called VSPO, one of them is called ASR.
So VSPO stands for Voluntary Irrigation Suspension Program Option.
That's right.
No wonder you call it VSPO.
and the ASR program is a partnership that we have with San Antonio Water System and how they use their aquifer storage and recovery program. But both of the programs also are dependent upon either a leasing structure or what we call a forbearance structure, in that we enter into agreements with permit holders to not use their water. Mm-hmm. And so most agreements are set up in ways where the permit holder can use their water until we hit certain, again, environmental criteria that are very similar to our critical period management plan, but it's above and beyond that critical period management plan. So you hit these triggers and then you don't use your water the following year, and we compensate you for that. And those programs work, and it gives us the ability to be creative in adding conservation to those programs. Those are our spring flow protection programs. Those set a baseline for us to ensure that we can maintain minimum spring flows during a repeat of the drought of record. But it also sets a baseline for us to build additional conservation programs onto. So, we're looking to establish and expand some groundwater trust programs.
Nice.
Whereby people can voluntarily enter their groundwater into a trust, and it could be used for conservation. We're looking to increase our ability to do these types of forbearance programs, looking at different environmental criteria or triggers that could be more beneficial to the region as a whole. All of it with two goals in mind, and that is to make more water available for use and to make more spring flow for both the species and ultimately the health of the system. And so we're excited about the future. We think there's a lot of opportunity to have some cutting edge programs from a conservation and water use perspective, and we're hoping to start facilitating the implementation of those programs as we get to the end of our existing habitat conservation plan and look to have that plan renewed or amended in ways that we can look forward again to the future. Everything that we're looking at is for a lot. You'll hear next generation a lot here recently at the Edwards Aquifer Authority, but everything is how do we set ourselves up in a way to be successful for the future? And how do we maintain the integrity and the quality of this aquifer going on into next generations.
I think a key word you were talking about there is voluntary, and that's a big part of regulation through service is these incentive programs where you're voluntarily asking people to join them for an incentive towards conservation. So you're not regulating people. You're not making them do it. They're joining on their own terms, and it's protecting the aquifer and saving water.
Right, carrot and the stick. There always has to be a stick, but ultimately we build partnerships, and our programs are more successful when they're associated with the carrot. And ideally, these programs provide a benefit and incentive to the permit holder and to the EAA, and everybody benefits. It's a win-win for everyone. We've been most successful in our programs when we can actually show a win-win for everybody. And there's a lot of opportunity out there for win-win. And as we try to build these partnerships and introduce these collaborative efforts for conservation and for permit management, overall aquifer management, that's where we want to be.
I think these pathways to partnerships kind of get us to that next generation strategic plan that we all talk about. I think that's an awesome thing that we have going forward is, securing and ensuring the protection. Thank you so much, Marc, for being here with us today. We appreciate it.
Happy to be here. It was a good time.
Marc.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.